Awesome. Hi, everyone. Nice to have you join us this morning and learn about phishing-resistant deployment. Let's go ahead and get started with a just brief agenda of what we're going to talk about today. One, we want to kind of level set on where we're at with passwordless, why it's important in this day and age, and then we'll get into the meat of why many of you are here is how can you actually start driving phishing-resistant authentication deployments across your organizations. And we'll end with a little bit of Q&A as well and get some questions from your side and see how we can help unblock and make progress in helping secure identities across the globe. So let's get started with some passwordless overview. At a high level, if you've been using passwordless in any of your consumer identities, your personal accounts, or even across your enterprise, you probably are familiar with a lot of these this general sentiment we're starting to see across the industry, right? Folks are excited about using passwordless and moving away from some of the clunkier authentication experiences that come with, single-factor authentication or the kind of gluing together of multi-factor authentication across different factors to meet needs. Just a few of these, right? Like people responding to the adoption of passkeys, coming to services like PlayStation Network and their Sony account, just making it a seamless, nice authentication experience to go through. Or if you've been using Windows Hello for Business for quite some time, folks are just excited that it's so easy to just go and open your laptop or unlock your device just by looking at a camera, right? Reducing that need for typing and that complexity to get in. So we're seeing a lot of this sentiment as more passwordless capabilities are being implemented across different services, across different industries for consumer accounts, for enterprise accounts, that folks are really enjoying this transitionary period of moving away from these traditional phishable methods to stronger and better passwordless experiences. So getting into this a little bit more, why do we need to go passwordless? Right. I think the first one is pretty self-explanatory in this day and age, but passwords are just bad credentials, right? They're reused often by users across all of their accounts. They're usually easily guessable. It's a prime attack vector for adversaries to go and do things like password reuse and spray attacks. It's not something that is very well used to protect accounts in this day and age. And we constantly see the attacks against with passwords at this point in time. And we've kind of added on to kind of try to improve the security of passwords by adding things like password protection capabilities, complex password rules, right? We've added the ability and looked at, research and guidance saying, hey, don't expire passwords to try to reduce the chances of users reusing passwords or choosing easily guessable passwords by just appending another digit or a character at the end of their password, right? We've been trying to add on to make passwords better, and we've been doing it also with MFA, adding in additional authentication mechanisms like a phone, for example, that sends a one-time passcode to the device, or relying on hardware security, oath tokens or software tokens or push notifications, right? And we're still seeing, while it's an improved overall security posture, or we see in over 98% of accounts with MFA are better protected, we still see adversaries targeting these additional MFA mechanisms as well. As we kind of approach this new world where new technology with cryptographically sound and protected hardware-backed security is available, things like security keys or our tried and true smart cards and certificate-based authentication, we have this new opportunity to really drive a more secure authentication capability through passwordless authentication. And one of the big callouts in 2024 going into 2025 is with passkeys and what the FIDO Alliance and the members of the FIDO Alliance have been doing to drive kind of the ubiquitous phishing-resistant authentication with passkeys across the industry. So with all that said, like this is why we need to move beyond our traditional single-factor, multi-factor authentication and move to a passwordless world. But just don't take my word for it. Cooper-Cole also did a survey asking organizations, what is the biggest motivating factor for you to move towards stronger passwordless authentication? And the results are kind of surprising, right? Some of the respondents cited cost reductions as one of the opportunities to reduce help desk costs or the cost for either hosting SMS or deploying other kind of MFA capabilities. Regulatory compliance is another big one as well. A lot of folks in the U.S. government and federal space needing to comply with NIST standards and phishing-resistant mandate as part of EO 1428. It's another reason why folks are moving towards a stronger authentication for the users. But across the board, the two top reasons really are improved overall security, moving away from traditional MFA to passwordless and phishing-resistant authentication, and a big surprising one, right, which is improved user experience, which is a sentiment we're starting to hear across the various organizations and users that we talk with, is that the experience of using and registering phishing-resistant authentication methods, such as passkeys, is much better and faster than utilizing traditional authentication methods like password plus some MFA as well. So what are some of the challenges, though, as organizations move towards passwords? Or what are some of the motivating factors beyond that that are driving the need for passwordless authentication? We just a few weeks ago released our Microsoft Digital Defense Report, looking back over the past year of trends in the cybersecurity space and attack vectors year over year. And unfortunately, like, no surprise to the analysis and that we've done, but there is a pretty massive increase in phishing attacks, which is responsible to upwards of 70% of the data breaches that are being observed. Alongside of those things, when we look at things like password-based attacks, we've steadily seen an increase in the number of password attacks occurring per second. In 2023, this was around like 4,000 attacks per second, and I believe we're seeing it around now 7,000 kind of password-based attacks per happening. So those password spray attacks and credential stuffing attacks are continually rising as well. But it doesn't just stop there. With traditional MFA as well, we are still seeing increases in things like MFA prompt bombing attacks, where an adversary is trying to trigger that notification, get the user to approve it or provide that code, somewhere around the tune of around 6,000 kind of attacks per day. But beyond all of the kind of vectors that we're seeing there and the kind of rise and shifting now to look at post-authentication attacks and doing token theft, we're still seeing that around 99% of the identity-based attacks are still focusing on passwords. And if you want to learn a little bit more about the trends that we've been seeing here, you can follow the link in the bottom right there and kind of read the full report, which will have lots of useful insights and maybe will help you drive towards your adoption of passwordless authentication as well. So let's talk a little bit about the passwordless promise. With passwordless authentication, we want to do a few things. One is ensure that we're providing a better user experience, better than just passwords plus MFA, to make it easier to adopt, make it easier for users to authenticate, right? Reduce that barrier to driving another authentication method in your environments. The other big one here is promising to remove attack vectors that exist with things like standalone passwords, right? With phishing-resistant authentication, your traditional attacks that we just talked about, it's a non-event. It's not happening, right? It's resilient to the sort of attacks that that could exist for those users. Since phishing-resistant authentication is usually bound to the RP, right? It is in its name. It's phishing-resistant. And then additionally, like, there is a wide variety of strong device-based authentication methods that you can employ to achieve this passwordless authentication method. So we're not just targeting one scenario, one device. We want to ensure that we have a wide variety of credentials that can be leveraged to meet the user where they are, to provide that seamless and strong authentication experience. And as an example here, we are listing Windows Hello for Business and macOS Platform Credential. These are platform-based phishing-resistant authentication methods that provide on-device seamless phishing-resistant authentication to access the device and access resources. But we also have portable phishing-resistant methods as well, like passkeys and Microsoft Authenticator, that can be used on the Android and iOS device to access resources there or in a cross-device scenario. And then also portable security keys that can be used across many scenarios, including desktops and mobile devices as well. And so as an example of that, with passkeys providing a better experience, we can take a look at Microsoft Authenticator, which we support device-bound passkey support on Android 14 plus and iOS 17 plus devices, giving you that ability to do that seamless same device authentication to access resources like Teams or any web-based resources as well. And then also enables the cross-device functionality, so that that device in the user's pocket can act as a hardware-backed security key or passkey and access resources on another device like a Windows PC, Mac PC, or even through remote sessions such as VDI as well. So with all that passwordless promise and the capabilities that now exist for wide adoption of passkeys, I do want to pass it over to Michael to talk about how you can actually deploy passwordless authentication in your environments.
Cool. Thanks, Tim. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we actually recommend that customers do to get on this journey and do this deployment. It's not enough to just say, I want to go passwordless, or I'm going to deploy this one type of passwordless technology. We really need to take a holistic look at where is authentication happening in your environment? What types of users do you have in your environment that have different scenarios? Things like this. So we're trying to be very prescriptive with the type of deployment guidance that we're providing to you. So the main thing that I'll call out here is we have a new guide that we published around a month ago at aka.ms/passwordlessguide. So if you don't remember anything else from this presentation, please go grab this link and go read through this guide. Everything we're going to talk about here is all just publicly available information that we're publishing at this guide to try to make it as easy for you as possible to go deploy these phishing-resistant methods. A lot of the guidance that we're providing here comes from learnings from doing these types of deployments with customers that we've worked closely with, and even from our own internal deployment of phishing-resistant authentication. We know from doing this internally at Microsoft and with partners and customers that it is not just a snap your fingers approach and you're done. This is obviously a project that will involve you potentially touching almost every user in your environment. They'll have to enroll for a new credential, start using new credentials. There's a lot of organizational change management that can go into a passwordless deployment. It's not something where you can just say, I rolled out a policy that says my users must enroll for Windows Hello for Business, and I'm done, I'm good. So the steps at a high level that we recommend taking when you're doing your passwordless deployment, start with determining your user personas. So every organization is a little bit different, and I'll get into a little bit more detail about the types of user personas we recommend starting out with. But every organization has different types of users. There's obviously information workers who have a one-to-one relationship with their devices, like they have a BYOD phone or a corporate provided phone. They have a corporate provided laptop typically, and they're fairly easy to get started with. Their scenarios they make a lot of sense, and they're fairly well defined. Then we can have some more complex scenarios like frontline workers. So people who are working in retail settings or restaurant settings or in factories or warehouses. There's also IT pros. IT pros are distinct from a traditional information worker. They tend to have secondary accounts that they use for administrative purposes. They tend to use a lot of RDP and other remote access technology. They interface with PAM systems. They have some unique needs. And there's other personas beyond that that you may need to consider depending on what your business looks like. From there, we need to look at device readiness. Because we are trying to move to hardware-backed credentials that are tied to a specific device, there are some requirements around what state are your devices in before you can roll out certain types of credentials. On the Windows side, most devices that have been procured in the last 5 to 10 years are probably okay. We're looking for things like Windows 10, preferably do they have a TPM? Have they been patched recently? Those types of things. On mobile, it can get a little bit more interesting, again, depending on what user persona we're talking about. So Android devices, like are they running Android 14 or are they running an older version? On the iOS side, iOS 17 is the bare minimum, iOS 18 is recommended. So you do want to do a little bit of data analysis to figure out what does my fleet look like that I'm going to use for these hardware-backed credentials. From there, as you've determined which user personas you're going to target, and which devices you're going to target them on, you can begin your registration. So again, this is an organizational change management project. So at this point, you want to do things like communicate to your end users, like phishing resistance is coming in 30 days, and here's what that means for you. Here's what's going to change. And then it's coming in 7 days, be ready, do your registration. It's coming now. We're going to start putting registration experiences in your face. Eventually, enforcement may be coming, and you want to communicate that to your end users. So make sure that you communicate to them, roll out these registration projects, and then drive the usage. It's not enough to get the user to register the credential. You also need to make sure that they're using it. So data analysis and using the logs that are available to you are really, really important here so that you can understand not only did my user successfully register, but are they now using that credential? Because eventually we want to get to the enforcement stage where we can look at the data and say, okay, I saw that my user registered for a passkey on iOS and they're using it successfully, and they're using Windows Hello for Business on Windows successfully, let's make sure that we're enforcing that they are using those credentials on iOS and Windows and cut off that attack vector on those platforms at least. And maybe in your data analysis, you see things maybe aren't going as well on Android or a Mac device, where the user has some other edge case scenario, like a developer on Linux that you hadn't planned for. You need to take a look at that data and figure out, where am I ready to start enforcing now to close down the attack surfaces and reduce the amount of surface that an attacker can exploit? And where do I still have to do work? And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. And then finally, as you start to get to the point where you are broadly enforcing phishing resistance, we don't want to forget that attackers are still going to be active in our environments. We should always assume breach. Thinking about zero trust principles, assume breach is one of the key principles there. We talk about the MDDR report and how most attacks are password-based today, but as organizations start to become more resilient to password-based attacks, attackers will move on to the next thing. They will move on to trying to do token theft or some other type of compromise that may take place after authentication. So you do want to make sure that you're thinking about how to do risk and risk remediation, how to do investigation in your environment, even if you have shut down this massive attack vector of passwords. Attackers will still try other things, and you want to be cognizant of what those things are. And we do have some guidance in the guide for that as well. So thinking about the personas a little bit more, what I really recommend to customers that I work with is don't get stuck in analysis paralysis mode. This is something that we actually see with customers an awful lot, where the customer wants to do a pilot of deploying some phishing-resistant credentials, and they start with their IT pros, because the IT pros tend to be the people who understand like why we're doing this. They tend to be used to being put into scope for pilots. They have some of the more sensitive access or authorization to things, and so we may want to lock them down. But what we very often see is that those organizations get really, really focused on solving 100% of the IT pro use cases, and they never start their deployment for other scenarios. What we typically see in actuality is that for most organizations, you are pretty much ready to start for your information workers. And so what we really would like you to do is not forget about those IT pro use cases or those other complex use cases in your environment, but identify, we have these sets of use cases, and we have ones where we are ready to make impact immediately. Like we are ready to go begin our deployment. And yes, we have edge cases that we have not solved perfectly for yet, but that does not mean that we cannot begin deploying in some of these other scenarios. So for example, customers that I work with tend to find a lot of success beginning their deployment pretty aggressively on iOS, sometimes Android, and Windows. That tends to be very easy to get started on, especially for information workers. And then later, as they shut down these attack surfaces for their information workers, they can turn back to figuring out what they're going to do for frontline workers, what they're going to do for IT pros. Sometimes they need to look at their environment and say, I have some legacy technology in here that impacts my IT pros that is going to take us a while to solve. That does not mean you hit pause on your entire project and say, I'm just going to leave my information workers vulnerable to attack because I can't solve some use case for 50 IT pros. It's not the right approach, but unfortunately it is a common one. So I just bring that up to emphasize that you really want to prioritize which scenarios and which personas can we make immediate impact with, reduce the risk to our organization, and understand it's going to be a journey. You do not need to solve 100% of your problems before you begin that journey. On the device readiness side, we do have some pretty firm recommendations for each one of the OS platforms. And one of the things that I want to call out is if you are struggling with one OS platform, again, you do not need to pause your entire deployment while you go solve that problem. So if you are ready on iOS, but not on Android, you can still begin deployment. Or if you are ready on Windows, but not on Mac OS, you can begin your deployment. So typically readiness on Windows is going to look like Windows 10 or later, but we do recommend getting up to Windows 11. Windows 10 end of life is coming up in less than a year now, I think. So make sure that you are planning on doing something about that. But probably the more important point for Windows is make sure that you understand the Windows Hello for Business deployment models. The Cloud Kerberos Trust model is the recommended Windows Hello for Business deployment model for, I would say, like 99% of customers out there. If you walk up to me on the street and try to convince me that there's a better deployment model for you out there, like the Cert Trust model or the Key Trust model, you're gonna have a really hard time changing my mind. I'm going to tell you over and over again, go deploy Cloud Kerberos Trust. It is the best thing to do for your environment on the Windows side. So make sure you look at all the deployment guidance for Windows Hello for Business. On the macOS side, like Tim mentioned, we have this concept called Platform SSO, and specifically Platform SSO Secure Enclave Key, which uses the same protocols as Windows Hello for Business. So it is a hardware-backed credential that is bound to the secure enclave that's in every modern Mac device. You can also use smart cards with Platform SSO, but for a lot of customers, they don't want to do all the investment in infrastructure and life cycle and external devices that smart cards entail. So Platform SSO Secure Enclave Key makes a ton of sense for them. This does require macOS 13 or later, which most organizations are on, but we would recommend getting to at least macOS 14 or 15. There were a lot of improvements in macOS 14, which is over a year old at this point, so pretty well deployed in most organizations. But again, you need to go look and see what do we actually have live in our fleet. On the iOS side, iOS 17 or later is recommended. iOS 18 has some nice quality of life improvements for end users. On the iOS side, again, we tend to see organizations pretty much ready to go to begin their deployment because iOS updates are fairly ubiquitous in most organizations. Like Apple has pretty tight control over their ecosystem, and so the updates are fairly uniform across the different types of iOS hardware. Android can be a little more of a mixed bag given how many OEMs there are making Android phones. So there tends to be a bigger mix of operating system versions if you look at your Android fleet. So you may have users on Android 12, 13, 14, 15 is starting to roll out. But to use passkeys and authenticator app, it does require Android 14 or later. So this is a place where you may need to do some data analysis and understand, do I have Android 14 users and therefore we're probably good to go? Or do I have Android users on older OS versions and we need to decide what to do with them? And for your organization, you need to make a considered decision. It might mean helping them upgrade their phone if their phone's upgrade eligible. If they're corporate provided phones, it might mean replacing them with a new phone that is sufficiently up to date, that it can support passkeys. It might mean giving them FIDO2 security keys that can be used on that phone via USB-C or NFC or Bluetooth. So there are some different directions you can go if you're struggling with operating system upgrades in any part of your fleet. Okay, once we have done the data analysis piece on our user personas and our devices, the next question is, what is the user journey that we actually want to send our users on to get enrolled? It's not enough to decide, on iOS I'm going to do this, on Android I'm going to do this. How do you actually roll it out? Is a really, really important topic. So the North Star user journey that we recommend starting with is basically this one that's on the screen here. So you will need to tailor this for your different user personas. Like it might look a little different for your FLWs. It might look a little different if you have high assurance workers, like if you're a government agency. There may be more smart card involvement here than passkeys, depending on your needs. But North Star, what we would typically propose is something that looks like this. So starting on the left-hand side, what we recommend doing is having some sort of process for onboarding and recovery. Microsoft does make technologies to help with onboarding and recovery in our verified ID product. So that is one direction you can potentially go if you'd like to use native capabilities from us. If you have an existing process that you already use to onboard your users, you can continue using that process as long as you like it and you're happy with it. The goal at the end of that process, though, is to get the user what's called a temporary access pass for most organizations, at least for new greenfield users. That temporary access pass is going to let them then go register their first phishing-resistant passwordless credential. For your brownfield users, like if you have users who are already in your environment, like the majority of your fleet, and they're already registered for MFA, for example, you may be able to skip this step. But for any users where they're new to the organization and you're onboarding them, or you're going through a total loss recovery scenario where they have lost all of their devices and now they need to start fresh, or if you have existing users that have never registered for a strong credential before, you're probably going to start in this left-hand column. And so at the end of that onboarding and recovery process, would highly recommend getting them a temporary access pass. Then you can move into the middle column, which is where we would bootstrap what we term a portable phishing-resistant credential. This credential is one that can be used on a multitude of devices. For most organizations, this will probably be some mix of passkeys in Microsoft Authenticator and physical FIDO2 security keys. Passkeys in Microsoft Authenticator, like Tim mentioned, can be used to authenticate on the device, like if you want to sign into something on your iOS device or on your Android device, but they can also be used in cross-device flows, like signing into a Windows PC, signing into a browser app on a Mac. FIDO2 security keys have some of the same properties where they can be portable across different devices. So we would highly recommend using that tab to bootstrap the portable credential. And then we move into the right-hand column where you would use the portable credential to bootstrap additional credentials on other devices. So if I have a Windows PC, I would use the portable credential, so the passkey in my auth app, to go set up Windows Hello for Business, or set up Platform SSO if I'm a Mac user. Or if I use an iPad, in addition to my iPhone, maybe I go set up an additional passkey in the Microsoft Authenticator app. The purpose of this step on the right-hand side is that user experience piece that Tim mentioned. From a security perspective, if the user has the portable credential, they can largely do phishing-resistant authentication across their different devices. And so we've achieved our security aims. But remember that the purpose of a passkey deployment or a phishing-resistant credential deployment is not simply the security, it's also the improved end-user experience. So by also creating these locally available phishing-resistant credentials on each device that the user is regularly using, we can drastically improve that end user's experience. So every time I want to sign into something on my Windows PC, I don't need to go search for my phone and scan a QR code with it and do the cross-device flow. That does make sense to do in specific scenarios like bootstrapping, but we don't want the user to have to do that every time. It's nice if they can open their laptop at the beginning of the day, it scans their face, and they're off to the races. So to touch on the verified ID topic, again, the meta point I'd like to make is that you do need to have some sort of onboarding process in order to get the user that temporary access pass, because again, our goal is to get the user a portable credential as early as we possibly can. And the temporary access pass lets them go from having nothing directly into bootstrapping the portable credential. Again, if you'd like to use our technology for it, we do have verified ID and some capabilities around face check. And we also have a partner ecosystem. So if you'd like to employ some identity assurance and processes where you might go have the user do like a document check, a liveness check, things like that, before they can be onboarded into the ecosystem, we do have some investments in features here. It does require some work on your side to set these types of things up. So for a lot of customers I talk with, this is something that they'd like to achieve eventually, but they do have some existing process for onboarding users. And so you may start with the existing process, but it's really up to you. The point is we need to make sure that we have a process that we like and that we trust to get the user that temporary access pass to begin their journey. Once they have that tap, they can go set up their portable credential. So this is what it might look like to use a passkey on an iOS device. But basically, we did update our enrollment flow a couple weeks ago to make it super, super easy to use the tap. We basically, if the user gets into an enrollment flow, what they'll see is instructions to go into the Microsoft Authenticator app, click Add Account. They can put in their tap, and it just goes and sets up their passkey for them. Very, very smooth experience compared to what they may have experienced if you tested out the public preview a couple months ago. Once they have that portable credential, they're going to bootstrap their locally available credential on their day-to-day computing devices. So again, if we think about our information workers, this is very commonly going to be like the work laptop that they have, whether it's a Windows PC or a Mac device. Just to show you what this might look like, on the right-hand side here, this is what it looks like if I'm using a passkey on my mobile phone to set up Platform SSO Secure Enclave key on my Mac. So I have to scan this QR code, do the cross-device flow, but at the end of that process, my Mac is able to provision a locally available credential directly on that Mac. And now I don't have to do this QR code scanning song and dance every time I want to sign into something on this Mac I use for my day-to-day work. But the goal here is to make sure that every device that the user is using regularly, again, you need to tailor this for some of the personas. Like if it's a frontline worker scenario and they're using passkeys, you may not want them to create a locally available credential on, say, kiosk devices that they share with other frontline workers. But if they are the regular user of this device, like in an information worker or an IT pro scenario, this is the laptop they use day to day and they're the primary user, we want them to have something available that makes their experience smooth, easy, pleasant, and secure. Now let's talk about driving the usage and enforcement. So one of the big learnings from some of the deployments that we've seen is that it is very, very difficult to just across the board enforce on a user. So if you looked at Michael and said, okay, I saw that Michael registered for passkey on his mobile app and he set up Windows Hello for Business on his Windows laptop, let's drop him into a group that enforces phishing-resistant auth across the board in conditional access. The next thing that you're going to find out is Michael had some edge case scenario where he was using a Mac device periodically, and he's completely broken on that device, and now he's calling the help desk, and nobody's happy. What we've found to be fairly successful is that you want to go not by user, but by user device pair, where basically you look at a user and you analyze, is my user ready on a particular device platform? And when they are ready on that device platform, let's start enforcing that on that user device pair. So if we look at Jane, we can see Jane is ready on Windows and iOS, which does tend to be probably the two easiest places to start for your information workers. But maybe she has an Android tablet that's running an older version of Android. We need to make a decision. Do we want to block her on that Android tablet, or do we need to make do some additional work or data analysis? So to start, again, we want to make progress where we can as quickly as we can. So let's start enforcing phishing resistance on Jane on Windows and iOS. So we'll have two conditional access policies, one that says use phishing resistant auth on Windows, one that says use phishing resistant auth on iOS. We'll have a group for each one. We'll put Jane in those two groups. And now we've closed the door on attacks on Windows and iOS at least. She can still use phishable credentials on Android for the time being. We're going to solve that eventually, of course. But we at least have reduced our attack surface while we go figure out what do we want to do about the Android situation that Jane is in. Same thing for John. We might look at John and say, he's ready on Windows, Android, and Mac OS. He's got some old iOS device. We got to figure out what's going on with that. But let's drop them into three groups that enforce across Windows, Android, and macOS, and at least reduce our attack surface while we make a determination for what to do with his iOS device. So we might target him with an email campaign saying, you got to update your iOS device, or if you can't update your iOS device, we're sorry, we're going to block it on such and such date and move you into enforcement on that device as well. Or maybe we need to give him a FIDO2 security key, which can work on some older OS versions. There's different directions that you can take with this, but you want to make sure that you are not just blocking across the board, as that tends to be very user impactful. What we found to be most successful is being granular by user device pair rather than just by user. You also want to go persona by persona. You do not need to lump all your personas together. Like we might go focus on our user device pairs for our information workers first, then move on to our user device pairs for our frontline workers, then for our IT pros, for whatever order makes sense for your business. But usually it's going to start with user device pairs for my information workers. And finally, you want to make sure that you coordinate this with your support teams. Again, I know I've said this, but I want to emphasize it again. To a large degree, this is an organizational change management project. It is not simply a technology project. As part of that organizational change management, you need to have proper communication with other teams like your help desk or your support folks to make sure if, as we're moving users into enforcement, if the help desk volume starts to crank way up and they're getting swamped, we need to ease off the gas a little bit, slow down our enforcement, let them get things back under control, do some assessment to figure out, did we make a mistake somewhere? And we need to pivot or make some sort of decision, or is this just the normal course of, we've moved into enforcement, so there's a natural bump in help desk volume. But you want to make sure that you don't just completely swamp your help desk. if possible. So try to have a little flexibility built into your enforcement schedule, where if the help desk gets swamped, you can ease back a little bit. As they get things under control, you can accelerate again. This is super helpful for a lot of the deployments that we see out in the wild. When you actually do the enforcement, you're going to use conditional access authentication strengths. So we have a built-in auth strength and conditional access called phishing-resistant MFA that you can see on the right. You can also create custom ones. So for example, if you don't want cert-based authentication, like you're never going to use smart cards and certificates, you could create a custom one that only has Windows Hello for Business and passkeys. One thing to call out here is, you don't see it on here today, but Platform SSO actually fits into the Windows Hello for Business bucket. We are going to plan to update the UX here to say Windows Hello for Business / Platform SSO, because they use the same technology under the hood. So that's just something to be aware of. If you do use this enforcement, it does cover Platform SSO in these buckets, even though it doesn't call it out quite yet. We're working on that. But you want to use conditional access authentication strengths. And a really good thing to start with is monitor your deployment. So to start, you can create a policy that's in report only mode to gather data about how am I doing? Like as I roll out and start pushing my registration campaigns, are my users getting registered? And if I was to enforce on them, would they be okay? Or would we have an issue? This is a really good way to gather data and figure out, okay, I have a bunch of users who registered for Windows Hello for Business. And for whatever reason, they're still using password on Windows. You can figure that out without making them scream by using these report-only mode policies. When you are ready to start moving into enforcement mode, we do recommend having a set of conditional access policies that allow you to go by operating system. So you might have 4 to 5 CA policies, one for Windows, macOS, iOS, Android, maybe a Linux one, depending on your needs. And then as you do your analysis and figure out, okay, my users are ready on iOS and Windows, you'd move them into scope for the iOS and Windows policies. Maybe you need to do more work before you can move them into scope for the Android policies. And then you gradually expand the scope of your enrollment. You don't have to do all users across all policies simultaneously. It's too much to bite off for most organizations. You can move them into scope gradually, expand your coverage until you're at near 100%. Then if you do need to collapse your CA policies, like if you don't want to maintain multiple policies indefinitely, once you're at the enforcement mode, you can kind of collapse down to one policy. But for most organizations, it will be a pretty long journey to get to that 100% enforcement mark. You'll need to go across your different user personas. You'll need to move them into scope across different platforms. You may have edge cases that cannot be solved right away. So again, make sure you plan on this being a journey. So I'll wrap up with a couple final thoughts, and then we'll take some Q&A. So the first, I know I sound like a broken record on this, but measurement and data collection are super, super critical. Make sure that you are measuring at each stage. As you start to push your registration, measure the registration. What are my users getting registered for? Are they registering for things and it's not working? Like, are they trying to register and it's failing? Or are they registering for something and then not using it? So make sure that you're using the data. This is captured in your sign-in logs. This is captured in your audit logs, depending on which step of the journey you're in. So we do have some built-in reporting in Entra ID that can help you with some of this, like identifying which users are registered, which users are potentially ready for enforcement. Again, if you are following some of this guidance around using report-only conditional access policies, you can actually use the conditional access reporting workbooks to do some digging to see, if I was to start doing enforcement for this user, what would the impact be? Like if I took a user and put them into one of my enforcement groups, would they just be dead in the water, unable to work? It's not a good situation to be in, and you can project before you do that, before you take that action, by using conditional access report only mode and some of the reporting workbooks. So make sure you're looking to see, do I have users who are in a bad state before you start pushing things out for them? And again, supportability, make sure you're planning your deployment in partnership with your other teams. Flexibility tends to be key here. If you can ramp up your deployments and then ramp down your deployments and your enforcements based on how things are going in your environment, that will be a little bit more successful than just taking the hammer approach and saying, today's your day, you're enforced, no ifs, ands, or buts, and potentially get yourself into hot water if you've pushed too hard. Couple don'ts. So don't get in your user's way. Let your security-minded people help you. What we mean by this is a lot of organizations will actually just kind of knee-jerk go disable things before they feel that they're ready for them. Like, for example, I talk to customers all the time who are blocking their end users from enrolling FIDO keys. If you have security-minded people in your organization who have gone and gotten their own YubiKey that they'd like to enroll into their environment to use the strongest form of authentication at work, let them do it. They can become champions in your organization who help encourage others to take these same sorts of steps and can encourage people as you start beginning your mass campaigns for your rollouts. So don't block people just because you're not sure yet about how you're going to exactly do your project. If you have a handful of people who'd like to use FIDO, passkeys, things like that, we'd say encourage them to do that. Again, don't plan on flipping a switch. This is a journey. So figure out what your milestones in your project are and accrue security and value along the way. You will not get to 100% coverage for every single use case right away, and you do not need to. You can still make significant security and end user improvements for your business right away or very quickly, even if you do have those edge cases that are tough. And don't let perfect be the enemy of progress. If you just sit around with analysis paralysis, thinking about all these edge cases where you still need passwords and you don't get started, you are really going to be doing yourself a disservice and your business a disservice. You need to make sure you are accruing that security value, accruing that end user experience value. Even reducing your use of passwords is still a win, even if you have not reached that 100% mark. So make sure you enable those credential policies. Make sure that you understand it's a journey. Don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Deploy passkeys wherever possible. Like, we really think passkeys are the future for phishing-resistant strong authentication. Get really comfortable with passkeys and Authenticator app. In the future, get comfortable with passkeys, synced passkeys, which may make sense for some of your personas and some of your use cases. Please think about passkeys in your deployment. It's going to be a really important tool in your tool belt going forward. And then don't forget about some of your smaller user populations. So I'm a Mac OS user, so I always like to chime on the fact that you can't forget about us Mac users. In a lot of organizations, there may only be a couple hundred Mac users, but they do tend to be people who are in leadership positions, sometimes executives, business decision makers, security professionals. You don't want to just completely ignore them, even if it is just a tiny sliver of your population. Same thing goes for Linux. Like, you may have a lot of developers on Linux. If you're a school, Chromebooks tend to be pretty popular. You do need to think about these scenarios, even if they do represent some of your more edge case scenarios where you don't have perfect solutions right away. And with that, I would like to turn to Q&A and see if there are any questions that we'd like to surface from the chat.
Thank you so much, Michael and Tim. I do have a couple questions that I had during your presentation before we move on to the chat. For those of y'all who are watching live, I saw we had some that were just submitted, but please go ahead and pop your questions in the live Q&A and we'll get to those as well. Just want to give everybody a moment to add in their questions. But first of all, I noticed that you mentioned early on that not all passkeys work for all scenarios. Can you walk us through an example of what this might look like and how people would decide what's best for them?
Tim, do you want to take that one maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're looking at the various personas and we're doing your analysis on where can you apply phishing-resistant authentication, and you're looking at things like IT pros versus maybe normal information workers or frontline workers, you have to kind of take into account what set of devices that they need to access and how they're going to access those. So for folks like information workers, right, it may be entirely fine to use something like a passkey and Microsoft Authenticator app and Windows Flow for Business. But for maybe your IT pros that are managing your production infrastructure, you want to have a higher level of assurance. And in those scenarios, you may need to leverage something like a security key to get that portable authentication as a higher essentially overall authenticator assurance level associated with it. In addition, like Michael talked a little bit about like knowing which devices users have, right? Are they on a Android 13 device that's not capable of using a passkey authenticator, but you would normally allow them to use that. So in those scenarios, you kind of have no other choice than to use something like a certificate, or the better solution, an actual FIDO2 security key that they can use to access as a resource on that Android device as well. So it's kind of like looking at those different scenarios and know those limitations and being able to apply the right credential to meet the needs of those users. But always going back to the fact that you want to try to take into account that the user has at least one portable, phishing resistant method that can take with them to use to access different devices or bootstrap new devices, and then also trying to have that localized platform credential as well for that seamless experience. So you need to take those all into account based on the limitations from a device perspective.
Gotcha. Thank you for clarifying that. And typically when I talk with customers about passkeys, there's a lot of question about synced passkeys, and we didn't really get to that today. Would you be able to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So synced passkeys are also another great option to deploy in your environment. It's really just kind of depends on the need again, right? Synced passkeys are heavily reliant on either third-party passkey management software or syncing capabilities, something like 1Password, or even relying on the native platform capabilities like the Passwords app on iOS and macOS, or Google Password Manager on the Google Suite, essentially from a consumer perspective. But the underlying requirement there is it's usually relying on a non-manageable, from an organization perspective, consumer account. So you're kind of putting the trust onto the syncing engine or the user's security level of their consumer account as well. So just you have to kind of take that into account from a various organizational risk perspective. We've definitely seen benefits of you leveraging synced passkeys for scenarios like if you're in the EDU space and you need to target your students, for example. It's a great scenario where you can leverage synced passkeys, which are a little bit lower assurance than device-bound passkeys or security keys, but they have the added benefit that because they're syncing across all the user's devices, they're more recoverable, right? So as soon as the user bootstraps a new iOS device or Android device, that passkey is going to be rehydrated there, and they'll be able to reaccess anything in the organization that's needed at a phishing resistant level as well. So ultimately, that means as a result of having that stronger authentication, you're also going to get the benefit of less impact to your help desk, less recovery requests and assistance that's needed from there, since you have the benefit of the syncing capability.
Gotcha. And then my last question before we move on to the folks that have submitted in the chat is that I've also worked with some customers that are mainly using FIDO2 security keys, but they're really trying hard to drive users to register. How do you recommend that they get this process started, or make sure that their users are able to get over that friction of registering for those credentials?
Yeah, that's a good one as well. So there's a few things that we can do in the interest side. One, we recently added the capability to trigger require registration that's based on conditional access policies. So if you're saying to a set of users, in order to access, let's say, your benefits site, they have to sign in with a passkey or security key, that'll allow them to then, if they're not have one registered and they go to sign in with password plus MFA, it'll trigger that registration process and take them through the process to get that credential and access. But if that's still also a burden and you need to rely specifically on the security keys, in Entra, we have introduced a set of FIDO2 provisioning API capabilities, where as an organization, you can build out a help desk application or security desk application and do an on behalf of registration of the security keys, and then be able to hand those off to the users to have them available day one. We've also started to partner with a bunch of credential management service providers or organizations like Yubico, Axia, Talus, and many others to help provide that functionality. So if you're already leveraging a CMS suite such as that, they have solutions that are integrating into Entra to help make this process easier to widely adopt and provision security keys across organizations.
Gotcha. Thank you for that, Tim. And then now to get to some of our questions that we have in the chat. Some folks were asking about the passkey experience for IT pros that are using their laptop to RDP into servers or into privilege access workstations or PAWS. Would either of y'all like to tackle that question?
Sure, I can take a stab at this one. For a lot of organizations, this does tend to be one of the edge cases where coverage with FIDO is not perfect today. There's a lot that can be done with authentication that's phishing resistant for RDP scenarios if you're using smart cards and the resource that you're talking to is an on-prem resource, which tends to be the case that comes up a lot with in the IT pro conversations we have. So obviously, smart card authentication has been around for a long time. On-prem Active Directory integrated resources understand how to do smart card authentication. So that's always an option if you need really, really broad coverage for scenarios that are incredibly on-prem oriented. So that's one thing to think about is if you are going to be giving your admins, say, YubiKeys, it may also make sense to provision a certificate onto them so that YubiKey can be used for either smart card authentication with a cert or FIDO authentication if they're accessing a cloud resource. Going forward, as more and more infrastructure does move to the cloud, there are more options to do FIDO authentication just natively and remove the need for smart cards and the certificates. So if you are RDPing to say like Azure Virtual Desktop infrastructure, you should be able to instantiate the RDP session itself with the FIDO credential, and then actually within the session, also use that FIDO credential for in-session authentication experiences, like if you need to sign into something in a browser. There's similar capabilities for things around accessing Windows Server VMs that have some level of integration with Azure. But overall, I would say that this is still an area of growth. There's probably going to be edge cases here. Like we do talk to a lot of customers who have like air-gapped infrastructure that cannot talk to cloud resources in some cases. So depending on your needs, you may need a mix of FIDO and smart card authentication. That's fairly common for a lot of enterprises that are still in kind of a hybrid state.
Thank you for that. We also had another question about for if users lose their device. I know this is very common when folks are trying to roll out these methods where they're concerned about support case upticks or things of that nature. So the question was, with phishing-resistant authentication methods being enforced, what's the workaround for when a user loses their smartphone? What do you recommend they go do? Tim or Michael?
Yeah, I can. I think we probably both have quite a bit of thoughts on this. So I'll take a first stab at it. So again, one of the things I would recommend doing is looking at your user personas and understanding what makes sense for your user personas. Part of why I suggest this user journey that you go on where the user has both locally available credentials and portable credentials is they're going to have more than one credential then. So if I lose my phone, I will still have Windows Hello for Business on my laptop, and then I can sign in on my laptop and go re-provision my new phone. Like if I went to the Apple Store, got a new phone, gave them my old one as a trade-in and forgot to set up MFA on it. You know, I can take out my work PC, go to the security info page, set up a new device. So having multiple credentials can be very helpful. Beyond that, this is an area where synced passkeys will definitely help if you have user personas where those are acceptable. So again, like students are a great use case for synced passkeys. And then for other scenarios where you have like a total loss situation, like let's say you have a frontline worker, an information worker where the passkey on their mobile device was their only credential and they lost it, or the phone broke or whatever happened. The app got removed, etc. In that scenario, that's what we would term like total loss. And that's where you do need to have a recovery process via like a help desk or something like that. Today, for many organizations, that is a fairly manual process where someone needs to call the help desk needs to validate that they are who they say they are, and then maybe issue them a temporary access pass so they can essentially start over. Over time, we'd really like to see that process become more self-service driven for a lot of end users. Maybe not all, like you may not want it to be completely self-service for your admins, but for information workers or something like that, self-service may be acceptable, where maybe you kick them out to an identity proofing service, have them go through some sort of identity proofing process, get a verified ID at the end of that, present you the verified ID. If the verified ID is valid, they get a temporary access pass, and it's fairly automated from the organization's perspective. That's kind of where we would like to see things go, and that's where verified ID and starting to explore that can really start to help you modernize that situation. Anything you want to add, Tim?
I think you covered all of it. That was very well put. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And then we had a question from Andy. I think we have time for 2 more questions. So Andy was asking, what is your advice for multi-Active Directory domain environments? So it sounds like he has an environment where there's not trust between the various ADs, and he's looking to enable users to authenticate between ADs with passwordless. Is that possible at this point in time?
I might need to know more about the scenario. There's potentially some things that can be done with Windows Hello for Business. There's definitely some things that can be done with smart cards. There's potentially some things that can be done with Windows Hello for Business or FIDO keys. But that's something where, if you reach out to us, we may need to dig into the scenario more to figure out what exactly is the art of the possible in your environment.
Gotcha.
So, not a great answer, unfortunately, but that's what I got for you.
No, for sure. And for folks who are watching this live, we have our LinkedIn's available and things of that nature as well. If you do want to reach out with some additional questions, if you're watching the recording or tuning in later. The last question we'll get to today is about frontline workers. So what's the best method for users who are not allowed to carry mobile phones into their work location, but you're still wanting to roll out passwordless for all of your employees?
Yeah, I think if mobile phones aren't an allowed solution and you can't, there's no assigned device where you can leverage Windows Hello for Business, the best solution probably is leveraging some sort of security key capability, potentially one that supports something like NFC, where you can have a reader on that kind of shared kiosk scenario. It will require that frontline worker to type in a PIN to complete the sign-in process, but it would allow a semi-tap and go process where they can essentially tap that security key to sign into the device, enter their PIN, and then authenticate from there. And there's various form factors from many manufacturers like HID and Talos and whatnot that also provide capabilities for smaller form factor badge-based FIDO2 credential as well. So depending on the physical need and form factor, there's bound to be a solution out there for frontline workers that can meet that need from the kiosk or shared desktop scenario.
Thank you for clarifying that. And with that, I would love to wrap up our show today for folks who were joining. Thank you so much for tuning in to this session. If you do like these episodes, be sure to share it with a colleague and let us know what you would like to see from the show. We do have a survey at aka.ms/425show survey where you can give us input as to what you would like to see from future episodes. Feel free to comment on our YouTube pages and on LinkedIn with any sort of feedback you have as well. Our goal here is really to give that deep technical content and deployment guidance that folks have been looking for across the Microsoft security stack. So don't limit yourself to just Entra. We do have a session coming up next week on the importance of enabling risk-based conditional access, which is going to be really exciting. We will be taking a break for the 2 weeks following that in November for Ignite and Thanksgiving, but we'll pick back up after that holiday. And so if you have a show idea that you would like to see as well, please put that in our survey. To register for future shows, go to aka.ms/425show/register so you can be on the list for next week's show as well as future ones. And our full playlist is available on YouTube at aka.ms/425show/videos. So thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for Michael Epping and Tim Larson for presenting. And we're looking forward to seeing y'all in the next episode.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.